And welcome to the second hour of NewsNation Prime. And we begin tonight with the war in Ukraine, now more than 2 months in. Heavy Russian shelling in the east this weekend as Moscow looks to take full control of the industrial heartland after failing to overtake Ukraine's capital of Kyiv. Overnight, the Russian military reporting it hit more than 400 Ukrainian targets, including a Mariupol steel plant where about 1,000 civilians are sheltering. The fresh attacks coming on the heels of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky meeting with a top-level U.S. delegation. That meeting taking place as Ukrainians observe one of the holiest days of the year in a war zone. A solemn day in Ukraine. Worshippers attended services today to celebrate Orthodox Easter as Russian forces continue to bear down on eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky released an Orthodox Easter message saying he believes in a new victory for Ukraine.
Today's great holiday gives us the hope and belief that light will win over darkness, good will win over evil, life will win over death. Therefore, Ukraine will win inevitably.
Hope on a much lesser scale did come today with the visit from Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. The trip marking the highest-ranking American officials to touch down in Ukraine since Russia launched its invasion 2 months ago. The purpose of the visit reportedly to focus on logistics of funneling more military assistance to the country's embattled troops to fight off Russian forces. On Thursday, the Biden administration announced an additional $800 million military aid package for Ukraine. And while the West has provided a lot of military equipment to Ukraine, Zelensky has stressed repeatedly that his country needs more heavy weapons, including long-range air defense systems as well as warplanes. Residents in Kyiv echoing that same request.
I think everyone wants more support. We want heavy arms so that at last we can manage to carry out a counteroffensive.
Overnight, the Russian military reported hitting 423 Ukrainian targets, including fortified positions and troop concentrations. Russia also saying its warplanes destroyed 26 Ukrainian military sites, including an explosives factory and several artillery depots. Most of today's fighting focused on the Donbas region in the east. That is where Ukrainian forces are concentrated and where Moscow-backed separatists controlled some territory before the war. Since failing to capture Kyiv, the Russians are aiming to gain full control over the eastern industrial heartland. Russian military officials announced plans to deploy a newly tested intercontinental ballistic missile by the fall season. That missile capable of carrying 10 or more nuclear warheads and could reach the United States. Russian President Vladimir Putin praised his military's development of the missile, which passed a successful test launch last week. Here now to help us break down the war in Ukraine and the latest developments there is retired Lieutenant General Richard Newton. He is a former U.S. Air Force Assistant Vice Chief of Staff and a friend of the show. Lieutenant General, thanks for being with us tonight. Always nice to see you. What do you make of the Secretaries of State and Defense traveling to Kyiv to meet with Zelensky, the first time this has happened since the war began?
Well, good evening, Ruta, and it's always good to be with you. It is significant that both our Secretary of State and our Secretary of Defense have traveled to Kyiv to meet with President Zelensky, especially on what, as you noted at the top of the block, the 60th day of this conflict. It's significant because it shows U.S. resolve. It shows U.S. commitment by sending really the top two architects of U.S. national security in Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin. So I believe it is significant. I also believe that they will now see firsthand and hear firsthand from President Zelensky exactly what he needs and Ukraine needs to now, again, not only stop, but defeat the Russians, particularly as they begin that offensive action in the east in the Donbas region.
So would you say this war is now entering a new phase now in month 3?
I would say it is. It's entering a new phase on a couple fronts. First, diplomatically, we now have both Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense meeting with President Zelensky and other, by the way, heads of state, as well as key national security officials from NATO. And so it certainly is on that front. We're still waiting for more of the economic and financial impacts to have occur on, in terms of what they're doing in terms of sanctions and so forth against Russia. But there's still a lot more to do there. But militarily, it is significant because the Russians were bogged down in the north They were not able to take Kyiv. Now they've regrouped and they're focusing now on offensive action in the east in Donbass. But the Russian way of war is still being played out, as we saw starting February 24th to this evening. And that is just to grind it out. Heavy artillery, take not only military targets off the map, but civilian targets as well, and just begin to continue rather to grind it out. So we shall see how the next several days, if not several weeks, play out.
And what if the Russian people get sick of the sanctions, sick of their men dying at war, sick of this invasion? Will that matter? Is there any way that Putin would lose power?
That's a pretty strong stretch in terms of him losing power based on obviously the dissatisfaction of the Russian people. That will take months, if not years, to occur. But nonetheless, he is playing to his domestic audience, especially as that special day, the Victory Day parade and so forth on May 9th, when, Russia underscores the defeat of Nazism and so forth back in World War II in 1945. But he still has to be very careful about his domestic audience, not only the wider domestic audience of the Russian people, but perhaps even inner circles that will begin potentially to turn on him. I'm not suggesting that's going to happen anytime soon, but he has to be very careful of those who surround him, who are giving him advice and what advice he's taking, if not only his own advice. But that will play significant, I think, in terms of his inner circle. And you're going to see players come in and players come out in terms of how he's able to control the Russian people and what they're hearing, but also his inner circle as well.
And you've spoken a lot about the importance of American support militarily, financially to Ukraine. The Biden administration announcing another $800 million package for Ukraine. Will we be continuing to send arms and aid even if this stretches into years?
I believe so. Not only the United States, but NATO. But the United States is the biggest player here, obviously. The $800 million that President Biden announced on Thursday of last week includes 155 howitzers and towed vehicles to move the howitzers around. Think of that as very large and long-range cannon fire that is going to be essential to attack the Russian forces in the field as they begin to build and perhaps move out in the eastern part of Ukraine. It also includes some drones and decoys and stuff and so forth. But the real key to this conflict and the real key to supporting Ukraine, and not only supporting Ukraine, but enable Ukraine to win, Ruta Bay, is going to be the sustained combat military support that we're seeing play out, not only in terms of providing them arms, but making sure that their logistic supply lines are moving fast to get the parts and equipment and arms to the Ukrainian military as they begin to really fight toe-to-toe with the Russians as the winter weather starts to subside, warm weather comes, and now you're going to see, again, a very, very strong, difficult conflict before us.
And is there any scenario in which you see Putin retreating?
I see Putin not necessarily retreating, but perhaps halt if he's able to take certainly the eastern Donbass region on down to Mariupol, down to the Black Sea, begin to perhaps lay claim to Odessa, which would then cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea and really economically harm Ukraine. But that's going to be very difficult for him to do. He may decide, and it's hard to get inside his mind, but next, what we could see as a sign that perhaps he's willing to negotiate is if he feels that he's been able to take the eastern part of Ukraine, especially the Donbass region, all the way down through Mariupol. So he has that land bridge from Russia all the way into Crimea, which he took away from Ukraine in 2014. That could be a sign that he may be willing to negotiate. But President Zelensky, Ukraine, and frankly, the United States and NATO would not want any type of a settlement based on Putin gaining any ground in Ukraine. And so I don't think that's going to necessarily be a card that Ukraine or the U.S. or NATO wants to play in terms of if that happens or if Putin calls for negotiations.
All right, Lieutenant General Richard Newton, thank you as always for being here.
Good night, Ruta Bay.
And reaction.
Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.